What would you do if the world's most powerful nation told you to take its outcasts? Would you bow, or would you burn the letter? In the heart of West Africa, a young captain faced that question. When America knocked on Burkina Faso's door with an offer, he didn't hesitate. One word split the silence of history: no. But what if that single refusal wasn't just defiance? What if it was the start of Africa's Great Awakening? The news broke like thunder. The United States had proposed a deal for Burkina Faso to accept non-citizens deported from America. It was part of a global plan, sending unwanted migrants to third countries with no ties to them. Many African nations had already signed. But in Ouagadougou, the answer was fierce. The foreign minister called it indecent. The government declared, Burkina Faso is a land of dignity, not deportation. Hours later, the U.S. Embassy suspended all regular visa services. To the world, it looked like diplomacy. To the Burkinabe, it felt like punishment.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Regional Cooperation, and Burkinabe Abroad has come to provide us with more information about the procedure for obtaining an American visa for Burkinabe citizens. So according to this information circulating on social media, we learned that Burkinabe citizens applying for American visas will now have to go to Lomé in Togo for the formalities. Can you confirm this?
So, I must say that it was with surprise indeed that we received this very evening a verbal note from the United States Embassy in Ouagadougou, which actually confirmed this rumor that had so far been circulating on social media. Officially, the primary reason explicitly stated in this formal verbal note is that the nation of Burkina Faso, much like several other African countries across the continent, is currently included on a specific list of states whose respective nationals have unfortunately not fully complied with the established and clearly defined rules and regulations regarding proper visa usage and adherence to immigration policies. This concerns tourist visas as well as student visas. And so, in this particular regard, the United States Embassy has, let's say, acted quite promptly and efficiently to fully implement this temporary suspension of issuing tourist and student visas to all Burkinabe citizens, who will now be specifically required to travel to their embassy in the neighboring country of Togo to officially obtain these essential travel documents. The official note, of which I have a copy, also specifies that the procedures will have to be restarted, not only for registration but also for payment, in order to obtain these visas at the United States Embassy in Togo. So this serves to confirm that what had until now been considered a rumor has been confirmed by the United States diplomatic mission here in Burkina Faso. Now, I have mentioned these reasons as the official motives. It turns out that the official note we received contains suggestions and refers to an agreement that the United States has been trying to propose to the Burkinabe side since the Trump administration took office. As soon as this administration began, the embassy approached us to make this proposal as part of the implementation of American migration policy. What was it about? It was about offering African states that wished to participate, since they are in a process of identifying and expelling nationals who live in the United States and who are not in compliance with their residency status, to expel them. The proposal that was made was to see if Burkina Faso, aside from our own nationals, was willing to receive other people who would be expelled by the United States. Naturally, this proposal, which we considered at the time to be indecent, is completely contrary to the value of dignity that is at the very core of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's vision. We said that Burkina Faso could not be that destination. As for nationals who are being forced to choose a destination, because we are a country with free visas, we do not want to become a destination for deportation. This vision was quite clear. Burkina Faso is a destination. Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation. And we made this clear by saying that the decision of Captain Ibrahim Traoré—
It was supposed to be routine, just another policy, just another deal drafted in the marble corridors of power thousands of miles away. But in Ouagadougou, the air was thick with something else. When the letter arrived from Washington, Captain Ibrahim Traoré read it once, twice, then placed it on his desk in silence. The words were polite, almost diplomatic, but beneath the surface lay an order: take them. House them. Carry the burden we refuse to bear. He looked out the window, at a city still struggling to rebuild from years of instability and war. His people had fought terrorists, hunger, drought, and now, the West wanted them to take in strangers they had never seen, whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a border. How much, he thought, do they think African dignity costs? That question burned deeper than any bullet. For years, African nations had signed similar deals, quietly, discreetly, trading human lives for aid packages and promises. Rwanda received millions. Eswatini too. The United States called it partnership. But in truth, it was convenience, a system that turned Africa into a dumping ground for the unwanted. And as those flights landed, as deportees stepped onto soil they had never known, one truth echoed across the continent: humanity had a price tag, and the currency was obedience. But Traoré was not a man of transactions. Since the coup of 2022, he had defined himself as an anti-imperialist, a soldier of sovereignty. He had expelled French troops, rejected Western dictates, and called for a new Sahel alliance, one built not on aid, but on dignity. To him, this American proposal was not an invitation. It was a test. Would Burkina Faso remain another colony in disguise? The retaliation was swift, calculated, precise, and cloaked in diplomacy. Within hours of Burkina Faso's rejection, Washington's tone hardened. Officials in polished suits spoke of disappointment, of a reconsideration of cooperation. Yet beneath those sterile words was a warning as old as empire: obey, or be isolated. In the corridors of the Burkinabe Foreign Ministry, the tension was palpable. Messages arrived from embassies, from economic advisors, from friends abroad urging reconsideration. Some spoke of security concerns. Others hinted at economic consequences. And in every conversation, the subtext was the same: a small nation had no right to stand against the machine. Western media wasted no time shaping the narrative. Newspapers in London and Washington ran headlines calling Traoré a radical populist, a destabilizing force in West Africa. Editorials warned that Burkina Faso risks international isolation. Yet in Ouagadougou, something strange was happening: the more they were condemned, the prouder the people became. Markets buzzed with quiet defiance. Taxi drivers played patriotic songs. Vendors painted flags on their stalls. For the first time in decades, national pride did not come from a foreign handshake, but from an act of resistance. If standing alone means standing free, one merchant told a journalist, then let us stand alone. The pressure campaign grew louder. American diplomats postponed bilateral talks. Aid discussions froze. NGOs whispered of human rights concerns. Visa services were officially suspended, forcing Burkinabe citizens to travel to Togo for even the simplest procedures. On paper, these were administrative decisions. But everyone knew the truth: they were punishments dressed as policies. Inside the presidential compound, Traoré called an emergency council. His advisors, some former diplomats, warned of repercussions: the loss of scholarships, the risk of sanctions, even the freezing of accounts. But he remained calm. They think fear will make us kneel, he said. They forget we have nothing left to lose but our dignity. That night, he addressed the nation. Standing before the red, green, and gold flag, his voice carried the steadiness of a man who had chosen his fate. They say we have offended a great power, he declared. But what is power without respect? What is friendship without equality? If their doors close to us, then we will build our own. His words rippled through the nation like electricity. In schools, teachers paused lessons to replay the speech. On social media, young people repeated his words with pride. The Western press called it nationalistic fervor. The people called it freedom. But the battle was only beginning. Think tanks in Washington began drafting reports about managing defiance in the Sahel. Aid programs were quietly reviewed. International financial institutions started delaying projects. Behind every bureaucratic delay was a political message: we can still make you bleed. And yet, something had changed. The very attempt to punish Burkina Faso only proved Traoré's point, that sovereignty was a privilege only when it served Western interests. The illusion of partnership was crumbling, exposed under the harsh light of reality. From Abuja to Bamako, leaders watched closely. Nigeria remembered its own refusal to accept U.S. deportees. Mali, already under sanctions for defying France, sent messages of solidarity. Niger's military government, facing Western pressure of its own, quietly applauded. Across the Sahel, the idea spread, what if resistance was contagious? Western diplomats feared that exact thought. If we let Burkina Faso get away with this, one analyst warned, others will follow. That single sentence revealed more truth than volumes of official statements. The empire's greatest fear was not rebellion, it was awakening. And so came the next stage, the information war. Western outlets began circulating stories accusing the junta of corruption, repression, even secret arms deals. Editorials demanded a return to democracy, that old euphemism for foreign intervention. But this time, the narrative did not stick. People had learned to recognize the pattern, demonize, isolate, replace. It had been used on Libya, on Mali, on anyone who dared to say no. In the cafés of Ouagadougou, the discussions grew bolder. They call him a dictator, said one student, because he refuses to obey. Another replied, if this is dictatorship, then maybe Africa needs more of it, the kind that protects our pride. For the first time, the West's moral authority began to fracture. Commentators in Africa started asking uncomfortable questions. How could a nation that imprisons migrants lecture others about human rights? How could an empire built on deportations claim to defend liberty? The hypocrisy was too large to ignore. Meanwhile, the pressure intensified economically. Certain development programs were delayed. Foreign contractors withdrew. Western banks began scrutinizing transactions with Burkinabe entities. On the surface, it looked like bureaucracy. In truth, it was coercion through currency. Yet the more they tightened the noose, the more self-reliant the country became. Local industries began to emerge from necessity. Farmers organized cooperatives. Engineers in Bobo Dioulasso revived old textile factories. Universities launched new research programs focused on indigenous innovation. If they cut our aid, said one professor, we will build with our own hands. What had begun as punishment was slowly transforming into rebirth. Then came the moment of clarity. During a press briefing in Washington, a journalist asked a senior official whether the United States had used visa restrictions as leverage. The official smiled and said, we expect all partners to share our values. It was a confession in disguise, proof that values meant obedience, not respect. In Burkina Faso, that clip went viral. Millions watched it, and the outrage turned into unity. They think our dignity is negotiable, one commentator said on national TV, but this generation will prove them wrong. Late one night, as the capital slept, Traoré stood alone on the balcony of the presidential residence. The city lights shimmered faintly across the dry plains. He whispered to himself, they wanted to isolate us. Instead, they have connected us, not with them, but with each other. Because that was the true consequence of America's pressure, it united the fragments of a continent long divided by fear. The embargoes, the accusations, the condemnations, they were the noise of a fading order. Beneath it, something new was taking shape, an Africa learning to breathe on its own. In the following weeks, delegations from Russia, China, and neighboring African nations began arriving in Ouagadougou. Western commentators called it a shift toward authoritarian alliances. But to the Burkinabe, it was justice, the restoration of choice. And somewhere between the whispers of defiance and the echoes of pride, the world began to sense a turning point. No empire lasts forever. No system built on humiliation can stand against the will of the dignified. So when you hear this story, when you see the world's smallest nations standing against giants, remember this, their silence is not weakness. It is the sound of history changing course. If you believe that no nation should be bullied for defending its pride, let your voice join theirs. Like, comment, and share this story, because in the battle for respect, even your words can be a weapon. There are moments in history when the meaning of freedom changes. Sometimes it is written in ink, other times in blood. But in Burkina Faso, it was written in silence, in the quiet refusal to trade dignity for diplomacy. For months, the world waited to see if the small, landlocked nation would bend. But it didn't. And that stubborn endurance began to expose something deeper, a mirror reflecting the moral collapse of those who claimed to defend human rights while buying silence with aid. Across the Atlantic, headlines portrayed Traore as a populist, a strongman, a rebel against order. Yet those who looked closely saw something different, not arrogance, but clarity. "We will not host the rejected," he had said. "Because every human being deserves to live where they belong." These words, simple yet unyielding, struck a chord across the continent. In Dakar, students debated them. In Lagos, street artists painted them on crumbling walls. In Bamako, soldiers repeated them before dawn patrols. Something invisible was binding the young generation of Africa together, not resentment, but pride. The old order was built on dependency. For decades, Africa was told it needed saving, by missionaries, by loans, by foreign troops. It was taught to kneel politely in exchange for crumbs from the global table. But the act of saying no to America had shattered that narrative. It wasn't just about migrants or visas. It was about reclaiming the right to define worth, not through Western approval, but through self-respect. In classrooms across Ouagadougou, teachers began telling the story of the refusal not as politics, but as a lesson in ethics. "What does it mean to say no when everyone expects you to say yes?" one teacher asked her students. "It means you finally know who you are." In those moments, resistance stopped being rebellion, it became education. Meanwhile, the West's silence grew awkward. The United States, long accustomed to setting the moral tone of the world, now found itself accused of blackmail by a nation a fraction of its size. No statement could undo the symbolism of what had happened. Because every time a Burkinabe citizen looked at their flag, they knew it stood for something larger than territory. It stood for the idea that even the smallest country can defend the largest value, human dignity. International organizations debated sanctions but hesitated. To punish Burkina Faso openly would confirm what Traore had said all along, that Western partnerships were built on coercion, not respect. And so, the empire blinked first. Pressure turned into silence. The world moved on, but Africa remembered. Journalists began to call it the dignity doctrine. Political analysts compared it to Ghana's independence in 1957 or South Africa's fight against apartheid. But Traore himself rejected any myth of heroism. "I am no savior," he told an interviewer. "I am only a soldier who refused an indecent order." Yet, that refusal had already become a torch, passed quietly from one African capital to another. Whispering a simple message, "You have the right to say no." That message was dangerous. Because once people realize that dignity requires no permission, power loses its grip. Western influence, long sustained by fear and favor, began to crumble where it mattered most, in the minds of the young. In cafes and universities, across dusty villages and digital screens, a new conversation emerged. It was not about aid, or poverty, or even revolution. It was about respect. About the right of Africans to exist without apology. About the belief that partnership must be based on equality, not obedience. For the first time in generations, the idea of Pan-Africanism stopped being nostalgia and became necessity. The Sahel was no longer a borderland of chaos, but the frontier of renewal. And from that frontier, the voice of Burkina Faso carried a message the world could no longer ignore, that true power is not the ability to impose one's will, but the courage to stand alone and still be right. If you believe that sovereignty is more than a slogan, if you believe that dignity belongs to every nation, not just the powerful, then make your voice heard. Like, comment, and share this story. Because one day, when history remembers who stood tall, your voice will be part of that memory. For months, the world believed the story had ended, a small African nation punished for its defiance, left to fade into isolation. But in the silence that followed, something unexpected was happening. The punishment that Washington designed to weaken Burkina Faso was turning into the spark that awakened an entire continent. In Mali, officers spoke of Traore with admiration. In Niger, young cadets repeated his words during training, "We are not a landfill for failed policies." In Nigeria, activists launched campaigns denouncing the deportation deals their own leaders had signed. Across Africa, a single idea spread like dry season fire: one country had stood up, and had not fallen. when the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou quietly reopened partial visa services months later. The world barely noticed. But Africans did. Because by then, the symbolism had already reversed. The West had not humbled Burkina Faso, it had exposed itself. The empire had blinked first. Analysts in Washington debated how this could have happened. How could a nation with no navy, no global influence, no vast economy, alter the balance of narrative power? The answer lay not in weapons or wealth, but in the refusal to be afraid. The same refusal that had once freed Ghana from colonialism, the same refusal that had ended apartheid, it had found a new voice in the Sahel. Then came the twist no one saw coming. What began as a political statement against deportation quietly evolved into a regional doctrine. The military councils of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, already bound by security cooperation, began to frame their alliance around one word: sovereignty. Not the abstract kind found in constitutions, but the tangible kind: sovereignty over destiny, over dignity, over who gets to decide what Africa is. By late 2025, whispers emerged of a Pan-African Charter of Dignity, drafted jointly by legal scholars from the three nations. The document declared that no African soil shall receive deportees without consent, no African nation shall serve as the refuse pit of the world. It was not yet signed, not yet law, but it was enough to send ripples through every Western capital. For the first time since independence, Africa was writing its own moral code, one that rejected charity built on humiliation. In New York, a UN representative from a Western country called the move symbolic and counterproductive. In Ouagadougou, Traore smiled. Yes, he replied during a rare interview. It is symbolic, because symbols build nations. The twist was complete. What began as a single rejection had transformed into a quiet revolution. And the true irony? The very pressure meant to isolate Burkina Faso had united it, with Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. The West had spent decades preaching integration through dependency, Africa had rediscovered unity through resistance. Across the continent, murals appeared on city walls: dignity is not negotiable. In markets, mothers told their children the story of the captain who said no. In classrooms, students debated what it means to be sovereign in a globalized world. And in every conversation, there was a shared understanding that freedom was no longer a dream borrowed from others, but a truth owned by themselves. Some called it arrogance. Others called it awakening. But whatever name history gives it, the outcome remains the same. A generation had seen that it was possible to defy the most powerful nation on earth and still stand tall. That realization changed everything. Because once a people discover that dignity can survive punishment, no threat can control them again. And so, in the silence after the storm, the voice of Burkina Faso became something larger, not just a nation's defiance, but a continent's heartbeat. The dust has settled, but the message remains. Burkina Faso did not win a war of armies, it won a war of meaning. In an age where power is measured by wealth and weapons, a small nation reminded the world that the greatest strength is still moral courage. From the Sahel to the Atlantic, the echo of that one word, no, continues to roll like distant thunder. It is not just the voice of Traore, nor of a single government. It is the sound of an entire continent remembering its worth. History will record the sanctions, the suspensions, the accusations, but it will also remember the silence of a nation that refused to kneel. And now, it is our turn. If you believe that sovereignty is not a privilege but a right, if you believe that Africa deserves to stand unchained, then raise your voice. Like, comment, and subscribe. Because this is no longer just a story about Burkina Faso. It is about us, all of us, learning that freedom begins the moment we dare to say no.